Hello folks, thanks for joining me, even virtually, to look at the role of stories in climate action. Hopefully you're seeing my slides up on your screen. And I usually start off looking at stories by sharing this picture, which you may have seen. It's a cave painting, quite a famous cave painting from one of the Lascaux caves in France, and it dates from around 17,000 BC, so it's been around a while, and it's one of the oldest pieces of art in the world. It's also arguably one of the oldest stories in the world, a visual story, the story of a hunt. There's no written language at this point, but we're still able to share experiences and ideas to create understanding because we're hardwired to tell stories, and we always have been. My first volunteering role was in a local communications project back in 1990 that used to help community groups write press releases, design newsletters back in the days when that meant sort of cutting out letraset and photocopying rather than Canva and Adobe, which are much better. And these days, as well as freelancing for Public Scanner, run a comics company, a Kick, working with schools and community groups to tell stories using comics, moments from history, personal reminiscences and experiences, all sorts of different things. And over the last 6 months, specifically, I've worked with SCAN, the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network, to collect and share stories of community action on climate change. Primarily, I've been using those in podcasts, but not exclusively. And I've also been delivering training to help other people tell and share their stories. And in fact, we're running some more of that next year, which you're welcome to look out for. So many ways to access and enjoy stories these days, from podcasts and community radio to blogs and Instagram. But there are some principles that I think are worth keeping in mind, regardless of what the medium is. And there are some practical things in terms of how you share those stories. So I'm going to try and briefly cover both today. I've tweaked my presentation from this morning a wee bit to hopefully allow a wee bit more time for questions and chat at the end. There's a bit of story science, a bit of chat from me, then a wee practical exercise for yourself, and then hopefully some time to ask questions as well. As a heads up, for the practical part of the workshop, you'll maybe need some equipment, ideally a piece of A4 paper, if you can manage that, and a pair of scissors. Scissors aren't, you don't definitely need them, but they would be helpful. But I thought, because it's after lunch, it's a hard shift, I'd start with a story. And actually, I'm going to share a short traditional story. Earlier in the year, SCAN had Professor Sir Jeff Palmer along to give a talk on the intersection between climate action and Black Lives Matter movement, and you can still see it on our YouTube channel. And I was lucky enough to work on a project he was involved with last year, and this is a story that was told as part of that project. It's called Anansi and the Pot of Knowledge. Anansi is the Spider King, lord of all the stories. Sometimes he looks like a spider, sometimes like a man, but always he's a trickster, trying to get one over on folks. Now, Anansi was already clever, but he figured if he gathered all the wisdom of the world, he could keep it hidden away. Then he would be the smartest creature in the world. So he gathered it all in from all the wise folk in the secret places, all the wisdom in the world, and he sealed it in a pot. Anansi knew where to hide it, at the top of a tall, thorny tree in the forest. Anansi's son, Nkuma, saw him sneaking into the trees and decided to follow him. The pot was too big for Anansi to carry while he was climbing up the tree, and he kept slipping back down, and I got angrier and angrier each time. Tie the pot behind you and you'll be able to climb up properly, said Nkuma. Anansi was so annoyed that Nkuma was right that he let the pot slip, and it smashed, and all the wisdom fell out. And just then, a storm came and washed the wisdom into the river. And from the river, it washed out to the sea, and then all around the world, and to all of us. Anansi and Nkuma walked home in the rain, and Anansi was a little wiser. Because what's the use of all that wisdom if a child needs to put you right? Beautiful illustrations for that story are done by the artist Barry Robertson. Anansi's stories are the best. There's certainly some sort of relevant symbolism there, I think, in terms of the suggestions of young people just being ignored, or people greedily trying to control resources, in this case, the resource of knowledge and wisdom itself. I also think there's something in the idea of all of us holding on to our stories, forgetting to share them when they're so much more valuable, when they're shared with everybody else. You see, that's the beauty of folk tales. They speak to us on a fundamental level. They work so well because we can project our own feelings and understanding onto them. That's what makes them timeless. Stories which succeed, stories that are remembered, retold and shared, have that universality, have something that we can connect to, an experience or a feeling that we recognise. And they're all around us, these stories. We just have to frame them the right way and tell them in the right places. And that's what SCAN and many other organisations are currently trying to do. We want to help people imagine a better future, a different way. And I joined the organisation myself just towards the end of the first lockdown. So as you can imagine, it's been an unusual experience trying to gather stories remotely. But my principal starting point has been that having lived through a crisis, or living through a crisis, which has created some level of shared experience. I mean, it's not been like a great leveler or anything like that, but it has created something that we all have in common. We should start where we are right now. So let's talk about what worked, about a response to the crisis, what's still working, what will continue to work over the next 6 months, and then move on to talk about how recovery from this segues into a green and just recovery, a well-being economy, a new way forward. What if we kept what worked? There's a reason we're talking about story more and more. We hear it in terms of marketing or of change, of entertainment. And it's because we now understand a lot more than we did when we were first sort of painting the animals up on the cave walls. We know how story impacts on memory. We know how it impacts on neural pathways. We know it helps generate empathy. We know it can make a difference. So to help make a difference, we all have to become storytellers, going where the stories are being told, sharing what we do, what we see, what we believe. And that can be tricky. It's a bit tough because not everybody's like me and just loves the sound of their own voice. But actually, the voice is the most important bit. Not how it sounds, but whose it is. We want a range of diverse voices, a wealth of experiences, an abundance of ideas, not just people who work in projects telling us about what they're funded to do. We want the people who volunteer. We want the people who access the services. We want community organisers talking to us. We want people who are challenging current systems thinking talking to us. We want emotional connection. First hurdle to go over there, and one that I repeatedly bang up against, especially in Scotland, and I'd have to say especially in central West Scotland, which is where I'm from, is the believing that you've got a story to tell that people would want to hear. So as an example then, briefly, here's my hometown of Greenock, which just before the COVID crisis, at the end of January, was revealed to be the most deprived area in Scotland, according to the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. 6 weeks later, it was swiftly established that we were also the COVID capital of Scotland, with infections and fatalities up to 3 times higher than the rest of the country. And yet, that managed not to be the overarching story. Instead, our story became one of mutual aid, of a resurgence of community spirit, and in particular, how climate action focused groups in the area had come to the forefront of the community response. From redistributing surplus food to providing recycled bikes to key workers, refurbished laptops to homeschoolers, it was that the town focused on. That was the story that we chose to tell about ourselves rather than the story that was being told. And sure enough, the fact that we were a COVID hotspot and a responsive community and within driving distance of Glasgow meant that news crews from STV and BBC started to turn up. And Inverclyde has, I think, genuinely been on the news or in the media in some way or another pretty much every week since then. Last week we were on the One Show with a story about school dinners. The week before that I was on Radio Scotland talking about our Halloween festival. The door was opened and all these stories were there. Loads of people had stories to tell. Now these things, those responses, they'll have happened, I dare say, in your community as well, right? Circumstance made them newsworthy in Inverclyde, and the sharing of that story then created an impact locally. And I suppose the point I'm making is that on this occasion, we told a different story and people listened. The act of listening is hugely important in terms of finding and sharing stories within community settings, especially when you're trying to find an emotional connection. It builds trust, that listening. It helps create a safe space for people to talk. So when you're maybe chatting to folk to try and pull those stories together, find those stories, or maybe you're recording your volunteers or fellow activists or colleagues, here's a few points about an approach called deep listening, which I think is particularly useful in community settings. It has its roots in mindfulness techniques, often in counselling and in treatment, but it works well in communities when you're looking for stories. And it's about giving people your genuine attention, not sort of rattling through a tick list of questions, taking the time to think about and respond to what they say. And often when we're looking for stories, or when we're putting something together for a report or a newsletter or something like that, we maybe forget that there's a purpose to the story. The process is part of that. It's not just quickly let's make it happen and get it done. The more time you take to find that story and listen, the richer the story is going to be. So I like the idea of open questions. These kind of questions here. It's about how you listen and the notion of listening between the lines to notice what bits are being left out. That's where you then go. That's where you follow through. That encourage more answers there. Dig a wee bit deeper. If you've done any reading, if you're a fan of stories or folk tales or any of that kind of thing, and you've looked at any of the principles of it all, you'll maybe be familiar with the hero journey, which is this idea of the hero with 1,000 faces that was popularised by Joseph Campbell, which suggests that story cycles around all cultures follow a similar pattern. The person's called to adventure, they refuse the call, and then they transform into the hero. It's fascinating. It's not perfect. Lots of people suggest there's something quite gendered in its approach. It's very focused on Western story types, but we still see it at play. Most obviously kind of boiled down into the 3-act structure of blockbuster movies, or the beginning, middle, and end approach that we teach to school pupils when we're trying to get them how to understand how to tell stories. Although we're talking here about fictional stories, there's one part of that rings true for all stories, including community stories, and it's this midpoint, this moment of change. Even in community stories, we see it. There was a need for this activity in my community because, or we came together to take action because. There's a moment when you went from not doing the thing to doing the thing. And the chances are that's one of the most interesting parts of your story, the why. That midpoint, and in fact, the whole storytelling approach is going into the woods. And I love that sense of moving to a place that's sort of symbolically unknown, where magic happens. That moment of change is what I like in stories, and it's important when we want to create stories that encourage or create change in others, that we focus on that, we include that. I mean, stories are subjective, they're an art, but it's sometimes useful, and maybe make a wee note to yourself to do this later, to think about what the stories are that you like when you read newspaper stories, or even in fiction. What do you like? Because those are the stories that you might be better placed to tell. I saw this image shared again last week, and I guess you'll have seen it many times before. It's about how the richest 10% are responsible for 50% of the world's CO2 emissions, about how even just living in one of these countries makes us all responsible for contribution to climate change, even if we're adopting a greener lifestyle. And it's hard not to feel hopeless in the face of that, hard to feel that you're making any kind of difference at all. Arguably, that might be part of the point of this story. Because surely there's just so much scientific data now, that so much proof of the danger that we're in, that people should just understand it, should be taking it more seriously. Well, that would be the case if that's how stories worked. Because it's not just how you tell it. Just because something is factually true doesn't make it meaningful. The reality is, if a story is meaningful, people are more likely to believe that it is true. Now, this is an extreme and controversial example of that, but you only have to stray into the sort of COVID-19 discussions on Facebook groups to see similar situations play out. Some people want to believe the virus, for example, is a conspiracy, because that's actually marginally more comforting than believing that nobody's in control of this absolute chaos. Other people want to believe that we can all do our bit to keep people safe. People want to believe things that make them feel safer, or in control, or in the know, or right, smarter. So how else can we make things meaningful? The best recent examples of stories that affect change and actively disrupted norms and inspired action have at their root the story of just one key individual. And those stories were quickly added to and expanded upon, and lots of other people added to them. to create huge new narratives which challenged society. And that's not happened by accident. Those stories, how they were crafted, how they were then shared and retold, were weaponized to force change. It was purposeful. But let's be practical, because we've only got 40 minutes. And, you know, really what you want is some basic things that can help you tell your story. And then we can maybe have a wee shot at you doing something like that. There's pages and pages of stuff online. But I particularly enjoy and would recommend a beautiful, simple book from a writer called Babette Buster called The Do Story. And these are a few of the key principles that crop up in Do Story. Tell your story as if you're telling it to a friend. Like, make it conversational, you know. That's how listeners or readers will then experience it. And it sort of helps establish that sense of connection. That's really important for me when we're doing podcasts, because, you know, there's a conversational, it's quite an intimate experience. People are listening to a podcast. The tone needs to be kind of conversational. Explain, please, but keep it short. Don't get bogged down in the detail. Don't tell us the day of the week or all that sort of stuff unless it's relevant. Tell us just what we need to know, then move on. And keep it simple and active, right? Don't overdo it with the words. Juxtapose. Mash stuff up. This crashing together of things. Flipping expectation. That makes always for an interesting story. So Inverclyde being a deprived area where people then helped one another was a juxtaposition that interested people. That became the story. This is the most important one, I think, the gleaming detail. And I've used this example a few times before, but Scan did some podcasts last year, and there's a conversation on one of them that happens in a repair cafe, and there's a woman talking about buying this jumper that she really likes in a charity shop, and it's a really expensive jumper that she would never normally have been able to purchase. She finds it in a charity shop, she gets it, she loves it, she wears it all the time, and then there's a hole in it. And the people in the repair cafe show her how to fix and mend the hole in the jumper so she can keep wearing it. And it's beautifully simple, but I remembered everything else about that project off the basis of the emotional connection of that jumper, the fact that it meant something to somebody. It was all about how somebody felt. That is the gleaming detail. Be vulnerable. I love stories where people learn from mistakes or explain how nervous they are, because then they feel more like me. They're more like the rest of us. They're just doing their best, trying their best. Include that. Don't be afraid to do that. You don't have to be pretending that we're all brilliant at doing all of this. Most of us are winging it about half the time, at least. Tune into your senses. In the story of the jumper, there's a real sense of that kind of tactile connection. Stories about how people coped during COVID. Birdsong frequently features as a sort of contrast to the scared silence. Bring it to life with some sort of sensory detail. Bring yourself. And this can be the hardest one for people, because how we feel about ourselves might change from week to week. But if you've been part of something, then you shouldn't shy away from being part of the story. It's your story too. Who better to tell it? And then, of course, eventually stop. Not just structurally, but also because people are more and more used to units and digestible chunks, things to go on for ages and ages. Sometimes a story's done like that, and it can create a huge amount of impact because of its simplicity. And mostly, I've been talking about collecting and sharing stories, things that already exist. And Nancy, who we heard about earlier, is part of the creation myth of Ghana. Creation myths are the stories we tell ourselves about how we came to be. And they're important culturally, but also we have our own versions in family trees, in organisations, and groups of friends. Creation myths help us define who we are, right? Now, you may also have heard recently talk of something called control mythologies. And these are the parts of life that are presented as self-evident truths, things that are too big to change, because that's just how they are. Things like there'll be a technological solution to the environmental crisis, or all economic growth is good. And already we've seen the control mythology of a new normal, or back to normal, return to normal, being asserted, pushing us all swiftly back to the unsustainable status quo that existed before the crisis. And it's framed in all sorts of ways, from moral duty to saving the economy, civil liberties, safety, comfort. And it's hard to counter the comfort of what normality used to mean, especially after a period of such extreme change. The new normal, though, hasn't asserted itself yet. agents of change, and that's all of you, don't accept the control myth as the terms of the debate. Now is when we get to tell the stories that help define what the new normal might be. And that's the space, I think, right there, where we should work, where our stories should work, where they fit best. Believing the world was ending used to be much, much harder. But even in the face of a crisis like this, we're trying to go on planes, to go on holidays, we're buying cut price meals, we're queuing up to buy fast fashion. And I'm not judging any of that, because we all have our own normal, our own barometer of risk. But I suppose my point is, if an actual live pandemic won't change behaviour at large, then who's to say the climate emergency will either? So instead, let's look at what has changed and gather our momentum from there. More people want to keep working from home. More people have recognised the importance of a green recovery and have a greater appreciation of the environment around them. More mutual aid groups are working in communities. More people are volunteering than before. More people have understood the realities of supply chains and food resiliency. The well-being economy is now seriously being discussed and debated. And so we can ask, well, if we could do it back then, why can't we just keep doing it? If they can do it over there, why can't we do it? What if we just kept doing it this way? And creating that inspiration, that dissonance, is vital to creating an influence and change with stories. What if it isn't the apocalypse? What if things could only get better? What if that's what we told stories about? We talk about a crisis of imagination, but we have to be careful not to sound like we're condemning people for their lack of imagination, because that keeps people at a distance, people they need to bring with us. And it excludes folk. Rob Hopkins and others talk brilliantly, obviously, about the redistribution of imagination to get back to a place where imagination is not a luxury. So we should absolutely then be telling stories of our imagined futures, which is what I've already been hearing when I'm around speaking to folk in the network and that are running new community food networks or rewilding groups or any other of the amazing things that I've been hearing about. So that's one way of doing it, and that's certainly the way I've been doing it, because that links to my podcast. But it doesn't need to be how you tell your story, but maybe it is how you should use your story. And every single principle that I just very briefly shared about stories, from how you listen to the gleaming detail, how the change you want to see in your community can impact on one individual through the sensory experience that changes will create, all of those can be used. And we're going to take a very brief bit of time to do just that. I want you to make a storybook. And what I want you to do is tell me about a time you've been working and taking action in your community. I don't know you all, but I'm guessing that's probably the kind of place you're coming from. And so you've got two choices. I don't want you to tell me about your project. I want you to tell me about what it feels like to work in your project, why you do it, find the gleaming detail. Either you work with a school to plant trees and had a great laugh, or the first time your community food initiative made soup and you all sat down to eat it. I don't know anything at all, right? It doesn't need to be huge and world-changing. It just needs to have changed you a wee tiny bit. That made you feel that it was possible to do things differently, right? Or you can tell a story that shares your vision for your little part of the world, the change you're going to make, with all the same vivid details. So I'm going to put this slide back up briefly in a moment, but maybe take a wee snap of it if you're able to just now, right? And I'm going to show you very quickly the kind of storybook that I want us to do, okay? Right. What I want you to do here is get your A4 bit of paper, fold it in half, and then fold it again, and then fold it again. So you folded it 3 times, right? And then unfold it so you can see what you've got are like 8 sections there, right? And then what I want you to do with your pair of scissors, if you have it, is just cut along this middle section here, right? So not the open end, the closed end. You've cut along the middle, right? Until you've got this sort of quacking duck Pac-Man thing, right? So you, right? Then fold it over, push it together like so, until what you have, just fold it and then fold it back down. And what you end up with is a wee 8-page storybook that corresponds to the 8 different parts of the story that I gave you there, right? Okay, so what I want you to do, so we've got maybe, let's see, what time will we finish? We've got another 15 minutes. So let's just say 5 minutes tops, right? Maybe not even. Take a wee moment to sort of make your storybook, or very quickly jot some notes down about the type of story you might want to tell using the structure that I've suggested to you. And then we'll come back after a few moments and we'll take some questions at the end. I can see there's a few there, and we'll see if we can answer those. Okay. So I'm going to pop my screen back up now so you can see the stories, the story types once again.
There's been a request if you can show us again where they need to cut the paper.
Of course, right, hang on a wee second. That is good fun, that bit, right? Okay, so if you fold it, so to take it back a step, if you fold it so you got it in half, like so, right? And then it's along the middle. So not this end of the fold, this end of the fold, right? And you cut it there, just a quarter across, right? So that what you end up with is that sort of quacking Pac-Man thing, right? So it's kind of in the middle. Yeah. It's quite basic origami, but it is, you know, it is tricky if you've never done it before. And then you fold it over again, push it together, and there's your book. I use this quite a lot in groups to help people start planning how to tell stories. Okay, so I'll pop that. But if you haven't managed to do that, don't worry. Just use your bit of paper and write the eight things on it. Okay, and we'll say let's do that for 2 or 3 minutes. All right, and then I'll come back for some questions. Even if all you're doing at this point is just taking a wee note of those and popping them on the page, it's something you can come back to later on. It's a useful exercise to do as a group, to start actually thinking about how you might share a collective story. You start with the individual, you think about yourself and you know how these things apply to you, but then collaboratively you can begin to use it to put stories together as well. And the presentations, I believe, will be up online, so if you missed the folds and all the rest of it, you can watch that back at some point and use it as a wee exercise yourself if you like. Generally, if I was doing this as a full day workshop, which is often what I do with the story sessions, we would allow like a good sort of 20 minutes for something like this, if not longer, because part of it is about taking the time, the luxury of time to think about your story, because you don't always, right? So we're maybe not recreating that quite right for you today, but I would urge you to think about maybe doing it later on, about, you know, taking some time later, half an hour to yourself, and then going through this wee exercise of putting the story together and making sure it's yours, making sure it's personal. Okay, so I'm going to pop this off now and we'll see if there's any questions that I can share. What I would also normally like to do is ask people to share me their story. You know, we go round as a circle, we form a story circle, and you know, there's maybe a dozen of us or however many, and everybody shares their story and we all listen to one another's story. You can even do that quite effectively digitally. I've been doing that in a few of the workshops. So are there any questions so far that I can help with?
There is one from Anna, which goes, do you have any suggestions for approaches or consideration when sharing or telling a story that isn't our own? That's following on the heels of Michaela's amazing keynote on justice. They're feeling extra mindful of misrepresentation and misuse of voices. So we just had a really interesting keynote on racial justice and systems of oppressions. So I think this question is coming up after this.
I think, well, I was saying a wee bit at the start about how the thing that's maybe most important in story is voice. And I suppose all the storytelling that I'm talking about today is collaborative. So when I'm talking about, so I'm Scan Story Weaver and I'm working to get stories of climate action, I'm really the facilitator to help those stories happen, to help those stories be told, to be the sort of sounding board for folk to tell me their story and me maybe to help them shape it so that they feel confident to tell it. But the voice is always the person's, and that you're absolutely right. That is critical, right? Because there's no real excuse for packaging up a story as being symbolic or useful to your particular cause and retelling it. Why retell a story when you might have the actual person right here to get you to tell the story that you can work with to tell the story? So I think that's really important. I think we've also been quite conscious of trying to be open to as many people as possible to try and find those stories. But you also have to go and look, which, because if you just wait for people to come and tell you their stories, the chances are you're going to find the same types of groups, types of organisations, types of people that are coming forward all the time. And that's not to criticise any of those folks and the good work that they're doing, but there's patterns and styles of delivery, and so you actually actively need to go and find folk elsewhere and make sure you're not just ploughing the same furrows, looking in the same places, going to the same organisations, towns, countries. You have to be going elsewhere to find those stories. Otherwise, you're not being representative. I think it's fair to say that most of the stories that we've been collecting are quite representative of particular parts of Scotland, but they're not necessarily representative of Scotland as a whole. So always, always, always really mindful of the voice in the story. That's one of the most important things to me. Mm-hmm. But I think I'm sorry I missed that presentation. That sounded brilliant. Right, okay. So I can see what you've got there, and actually started. Well, you maybe missed. I started with a story which isn't mine, which is an African folktale, which I was telling on the basis of it being shared in a project that Professor Sir Jeff Palmer had been involved in, and I think it's really important when you're using, because a lot of my work, I write children's fiction as well, and I do a lot with folklore and folktales. I think you have to be especially mindful of where those voices are coming to, and the filter that those stories have come through, because the version of a story you might know as a traditional story might have been tweaked, changed, edited by particular audiences for particular audiences, so it's lost some of the nuance and the legitimacy that it had originally. But the good thing is about finding out all of that stuff is actually the most interesting part of the process. It's that kind of listening thing I was talking about in the conversation. I do think, Brenna, that might be a different workshop, though. We should definitely organise it. That would be nice. I don't know that it's for me to deliver that one, but I think I would love to attend it. Are there any other questions or anything around storytelling? Are people making their books? Have people been making books?
Yeah,
storybook.
We actually have time if somebody wants to share about their storybooks.
Does anybody have a story they would love to share?
Yeah, we have time for this.
What if two people have different stories about the same thing? Brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because that allows a listener. So if I'm thinking about if that's okay, I'm seeing some folk want the things back up on the screen again, and they're rushing through it. I don't want you to rush through it, but I'll put the points back up on the screen, and then I'll answer this other question. Hang on a wee moment, okay? I'll share my screen again for you. Okay. Let's rattle through these now. And the question was, what if people have two stories but from a different perspective, I suppose, or two different stories about the same thing. And I think that's a brilliant way of telling a story, because really often when you do tell a story, when you're kind of assuming the authoritative voice, no matter how much you might be trying to make sure that the person's, one voice is in there or whatever else, it'll come from one perspective. If you're able to present a couple of perspectives, then the person listening, the person hearing the story, the audience, they get to make the call on that. They get to decide which version of the story works best for them. So I think that's a wonderful thing when that happens. In fact, it can be, some people do deliberately, seeking out alternative perspectives to try and create a bit of debate. And in fact, a lot of that's what's happened with some of the stuff that I was sharing earlier. People have very different perspectives, for example, on Extinction Rebellion, and it's, and both, there are valid points around people who are comfortable with it and people who aren't. The best thing about it is, though, that it's generated a debate at all. So coming from two different perspectives, I think, is sometimes a brilliant thing for storying. Hope that's helpful. If there's anything else, let me know. I'll mention again that the slides will be up as part of the recorded video. You can come back to them at some point. So I'm also just going to share this final slide here then, which has the link for the podcast, 1,000 Better Stories podcast that I present. And it's running for another, I'm running the project for another few months. Hopefully we'll be doing some more storytelling after that. But in the short term, if you've got a story that you'd like to tell about your project, about your organisation, about what you do, then you can see my contact details down at the bottom there. And we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your stories. Or perhaps you want to come along to one of the workshops that we're going to be running probably January, February, where we've got a bit more time to expand on some of this. And what we go through there is I help you create a story, like a 3-minute, 4-minute story, which you then record and we use in the podcast. So lots of options. And I'm aware that, a day like this, when it's all online and there's lots of people rushing about, there's maybe not the chance for connection or to ask questions or to reflect as it's happening. So feel free at any point, please, just to drop me a wee email or get in touch. And happy to help you further on anything if I can, because normally for me the best part of sessions like this is hearing other people's stories.